Thank you all for being here this evening. The title of this presentation is Tiny Bites for Health on Eating Insects and the Quest for Sustainable Protein. And again, I'm Valerie Stull, and I'm an interdisciplinary environmental health scientist, and I like thinking holistically about issues that impact health and the environment, such as agriculture and the use of insects as food, which I will share some background with you today and a little about my research. The first time I willingly ate an insect, I was 13 years old on a family trip to Central America. And the idea of eating insects was bizarre and disgusting to me at that time, but when a chef brought a plate of them out to our table, I saw it as a challenge and I went for it. I vividly remember how hesitant I was to raise a fried ant to my mouth and the squeamish feeling in my gut. But I also remember how surprisingly crunchy, crispy, and flavorful that bite was. Despite my fears, what I had eaten was simply food. It wasn't until years later, during my research in rural Zambia, that I began to unpack and realize the positive role that insects can play in human diets. I'll never forget the day the mafulefute, or flying ants, emerged from the ground after a major rainstorm. I'd never seen children so excited by the sight of insects before. They were running back and forth, trapping the insects in their hands, collecting them in their pockets, and giggling with joy. We fried some up, no oil needed, added a pinch of salt, and were snacking on them all afternoon. Popcorn is the word I use to describe what they taste like when people ask. Whatever ideas I had in my head about eating insects before this moment were wrong. Food is culture and tradition and sustenance, and insects are food. They can also be fun. If you recall the images from my title slide, I want to emphasize that entomophagy, or the practice of eating insects, is very diverse and nuanced, practiced all around the world by all types of people. I hope to share with you today a little bit about why this topic is worth exploring and worth our time. I should mention up front that the work I will share today is part of a larger collaborative research project called MIGHTi, the Mission to Improve Global Health Through Insects, that I direct, which conducts interdisciplinary research on insect agriculture and entomophagy. We are spanning the globe, working with collaborators in the US, Zambia, Uganda, South Africa, and Guatemala thus far. Let me start by outlining the current agricultural context as I see it in the most simple terms possible. Our food system is squeezed on all sides by a growing population, a changing climate, unnecessary food waste, and inequitable distribution, just to name a few pressures. As the population grows, more people will be able to afford those extra delicious but resource-intensive foods like meat and dairy with shifting demand. And while we are producing more food than ever before, we often do so at the expense of the environment, as we actually drive climate change through unsustainable agricultural practices. Moreover, millions of people remain hungry while others are consuming too much unhealthy food. It is imperative that we make change. There is clearly a need to generate innovative agricultural solutions that protect both human and planetary health. Insect agriculture could offer one such solution. I first became interested in this topic in 2013 when it was the United Nations that boldly recommended an increase in worldwide insect consumption as one possible means to address global malnutrition. Eating insects might seem strange to those of us that grew up in the United States, but we are in the minority because about 2 billion people are estimated to eat insects or live in places where insects are consumed regularly. They span 130 or more nations and regularly choose from more than 2,100 known edible species that are eaten raw, pan-fried, boiled, processed into powders, and cooked into a variety of ways. These insects play an important role in people's diets and cultural food traditions. As can be seen on this map, insect consumption has been recorded across the entire globe, with the highest number of species consumed in Mexico, India, and China, upwards of 200 to 300 species in those countries. Insect eating is largely a tropical phenomena, and specific insects are considered a delicacy in many regions with economic, cultural, social, and sometimes even spiritual significance or value. Eating insects is not a new idea, and there are many good reasons for doing so. First, insects are widely abundant. They make up about one of the 1.5 million valid species of all organisms currently described. They exist in every corner of the globe, and with so many edible species, they really do represent a ubiquitous and accessible food source for humans. Second, insects are nutrient dense. Chimps and early humans probably always ate insects, likely because of their high nutritional quality, which is akin to meat. Most insects are pretty rich in protein and fat. So if you compare collecting a social insect like termites to chasing down wild game, the insects are a lot easier to catch and require less energy to do so. Insects contributed substantially to the human diet throughout history, and there's anthropological evidence suggesting that insect eating by our hominid ancestors may have actually contributed to the development of our larger brains and cognitive evolution, given again that insects are rich in protein and fat. However, it should be noted that today, more than 90% of the insects consumed around the globe are collected from the wild or wild harvested. This is great because it's a free, locally available resource, but it can, if unmonitored, cause significant ecological damage, as has been seen in parts of southern Africa where insect harvesting has been linked to deforestation. And in other regions, overharvesting of a very specific insect can threaten the survival of other species in an ecosystem. And of course, when you're harvesting something from the wild, you're not always 100% sure what it's been feeding on or exposed to, so there may be food safety concerns. Lastly, insects collected from the wild are often seasonal, so they may only be available at certain times of year. So this is why I'm particularly interested in insect farming or mini livestock, farmed insects. I think farmed insects offer numerous benefits over other livestock, and they can be used for both human food and animal feed. There are also many environmental benefits to farming insects. First and foremost, insects require significantly less feed than traditional forms of livestock. This is because insects have a higher feed conversion efficiency, meaning that they're more efficient at converting food into body mass. And one reason for this is the fact that most insects are ectothermic or cold-blooded. So unlike us, humans, chickens, or cows, they're not expending calories or energy regulating their body temperature. In addition to having a high feed conversion efficiency, another important consideration with regard to feed is the type of feed required. And many insects can consume agricultural byproducts, food waste, manure, or other biomass that is not edible for humans or other forms of livestock, which makes them amazing recyclers. They can turn something that's totally devoid of nutrients suitable for human nutrition into a nutrition-packed snack, which is really great. And lastly, with regard to feed, many edible insects are almost entirely edible. This is important because some other animals like fish or chickens are also really efficient at converting food into body mass, but a large part of that animal might not be edible, say the bones or the feathers of a chicken, but you can actually toss a whole cricket and a whole mealworm into your mouth. Insects require significantly less water to produce than other livestock as well, and they're really skilled at drawing water out of their food. Mealworms, for example, eating a controlled or balanced diet require about 4 times less water per gram of protein produced compared to beef. And considering that agriculture demands almost 70% of the fresh water that we as humans use, this is a really important consideration regarding climate change. It makes insects potentially more drought resistant than other livestock as well. As I mentioned previously, insects require less feed per kilogram of edible product than other forms of livestock. Less feed required translates into less land used to grow that feed and less land cleared to grow that feed. So the United Nations actually estimates that some insects, like mealworms, require as little as 20 meters squared to produce 1 kilogram of protein, whereas beef would require at least 145 meters for that same kilogram of protein at a minimum. So insects can be reared in tight confined spaces, which is really cool. Some species actually prefer this. So farming insects could be done vertically, as shown in this picture. And anyone can farm insects. You don't have to have land or own land or have access to land. I've been farming insects in my 1-bedroom apartment here in Madison for years under my kitchen sink. So this is a picture of a really low-tech vertical insect farming system. So in my mind, this really links to issues of food justice and food sovereignty and makes insect farming feasible for very diverse groups around the globe and accessible. In addition to their highly efficient use of natural resources, most edible insects emit significantly fewer greenhouse gases than conventional livestock as well. Mealworms and crickets, in particular, they don't emit methane, which makes their global warming potential much lower than cattle or swine. So this graph is depicting the greenhouse gas equivalents estimated per kilogram of mass gain for 3 insect species, pigs and beef cattle, and it includes carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So pretty striking when you compare cattle to the insects. And lastly, insects are nutrient dense. They're really known for their protein content, and most contain all essential amino acids for human nutrition. They also have high levels of healthy fatty acids. Acheta domesticus crickets, as you can see here, are high in zinc, iron, and calcium with micronutrient values greater than that found in conventional beef, which we think of as being so nutrient dense. But for those of you with allergies, you may be interested to know that typically insects are also gluten, soy, nut, and dairy-free, depending, of course, on what they've been fed. As I mentioned, insects are perhaps best known for their protein content, and compared with conventional animal foods like eggs, chicken, and ground beef, the proximate nutrient content of farmed Acheta domesticus crickets compares really favorably. So as you can see here in the blue, the percent protein by weight in crickets is similar to beef and chicken, but higher than eggs. In orange, that percent fat is slightly lower, with the majority of that fat in the form of healthy polyunsaturated fatty acids. But perhaps most interesting for me and for today is that insects, unlike any other animal product, also contain dietary fiber, which is fascinating because we know that dietary fibers are those indigestible carbohydrates. They are the primary energy sources for gut microbiota, and thus they shape the microbial growth in our guts. Diets high in dietary fiber are associated with reduced risks of things like breast cancer, diverticular disease, coronary heart disease, and even metabolic syndrome. The real hook for me, or reason that I'm so passionate about insects, is that there are many uses for farmed insects, and we are just scratching the surface of what is possible. Insects can be eaten by people directly, used in animal feed, especially for fish or chickens, and there are new efforts to put them in pet food, thereby reducing the environmental impact of our furry friends' diets. Some species are great at breaking down wastes, from food waste to manure, which is such a problem for farmers here in Wisconsin to deal with, and even potentially to break down plastics. The waste from the insects themselves, called frash, is actually quite a good fertilizer. And lastly, insects can be broken down into their component parts like protein, fiber, and oils, and sold into broader markets with even potential medicinal uses. I've outlined numerous potential benefits of insect agriculture here, but it's certainly not all daisies and roses. There are many places where insect agriculture could go awry. It's a very nascent industry, and we have a lot yet to learn. We need to consider how should we treat the insects themselves ethically. How do we really optimize production and profits without going the way of conventional agriculture, which I would argue generally puts profits over other considerations? How can we mitigate environmental and health risks from farming insects? And where should we adhere to versus push against cultural and social traditions around eating and farming insects? And then lastly, I would point out that we really need to consider whose knowledge is being privileged in this space and why. So while there is good evidence on paper that edible insects and insect agriculture could contribute to improved health with a lower environmental footprint, I would argue that there is still a really large research gap, and claims that edible insects are going to save the world are short-sighted because we do need to know more about how to cultivate and optimize farming of insects, what the direct health impacts of consuming them are, how feasible it is in different contexts, what social acceptability is, and how they should be regulated. So these are actually all issues that the MIGHTi Project is investigating here at the University of Wisconsin. So I'd now like to jump into a really quick snapshot of some of the research that we've conducted, just giving you an overview of the topics we're thinking about and key findings. Let's start by thinking about the social perceptions of edible insects and why they matter. So let's consider the Zambian context. A country in southern Africa, Zambia faces extreme poverty and pervasive food insecurity. Malnutrition is very prevalent across the country, and in children less than 5, about 40% of them are stunted. At the same time, entomophagy, or the practice of eating insects, is common across the country, but the vast majority of insects are wild collected and often only seasonally available. To date, insect farming is nearly non-existent in the country, but in the last 3 years, a few initiatives have popped up exploring insect farming. There are also vast environmental resources available in Zambia. It's an agrarian economic system where corn is prolific. Corn is grown by 86% of smallholder farmers. So it's a country with a lot of land, a lot of resources, and a need for efforts to address issues with undernutrition and food insecurity. The benefits of mini livestock farming simply cannot be realized if people don't want to or choose to eat them. So perceptions of insects as food really matter in every context. Also, the benefits won't be realized if access to insect foods is insufficient to make a valuable contribution or dent to the nutritional quality of the diet. And if producing or collecting insects is too expensive or too labor-intensive, people will be unlikely to engage. So I wanted to think about these issues and really understand how people in Zambia currently perceive and think about insects and what information would be useful as we consider farming them in the future. To answer some of these questions, I conducted a year-long ethnographic field study in one rural village in Zambia. So let's jump straight to some of our findings. The study reinforced the idea that how people view edible insects now may impact their future adoption or rejection of insect farming initiatives. The people in this community described a clear connection between social beliefs and the desirability of certain insects. So in fact, they do understand edible insects socially. And I think we understand a lot of our food socially, but this was something that I didn't expect to be thinking about and is really interesting because we saw differentiation across species. And all of my findings kind of ran contrary to common assumptions that we have in the West about edible insects. We have a Western bias and we tend to think of insect eating as in a reductive way, and that all insect eating is associated by poverty and desperation. And this was simply not the case in this community. Insect eating was motivated by the taste and flavor of the insects, their availability and proximity, the cultural food and traditional food value of them, sometimes spiritual value, their believed special properties, and sometimes the lack of other options for food. In a Western view, we might also assume that insects are viewed equally as kind of one value set and are kind of a food category, similar to how we would describe meat or vegetables. But this was simply not what I found in this community. Insects were not thought of as a food category, so perceptions of one insect did not translate to perceptions of other insects automatically whatsoever. The species of insects that were most associated with socially desirable traits, like being wealthy or not having to work in the field, were the most widely consumed and the most socially accepted as foods. So those were insects with economic value on the market already, and those that could be collected in large quantities very easily without much labor. Insects that require a lot of labor, that must be caught one at a time, were more associated with less socially desirable traits like poverty and hard labor. So we really need to understand the context and recognize the importance of the context and people's perceptions when we embark on new farming initiatives. A main takeaway from this research for me is that an edible insect is not an insect is not an insect. And by that I mean that we can't simply assume that a farmable species that's consumed in one place will be readily adopted in another or will be socially acceptable, at least not without a lot of sensitization or education, and it's probably not the best place to start with something that's not viewed as food initially. We can't go in with haphazard farming technologies and assume that they will be readily accepted either. So we need to be strategic and really have an understanding of the context. So if you want to learn more about this study, it's been published in Agriculture and Human Values. The next topic we've been working on is trying to figure out what we can feed edible insects such that insect farming is feasible in low resource contexts. As we think about what to feed insects, we need to remember what we're using them for. So my main motivation is to think of insects as a supplement to the diet in the Zambian context, where the staple food is nshima, this stiff corn-based porridge. We know that diets that have more than 50% of their calories coming from corn put people at risk of protein energy malnutrition, and severe PEM increases susceptibility to life-threatening diseases like tuberculosis and gastroenteritis. So can insects provide nutrients that are otherwise lacking and help prevent some of these poor health outcomes? Maybe, I think they can, but the insect's diet is actually going to impact the nutrient content of that insect that people consume. One possible feed substrate that we might be able to use for insects that's widely available in Zambia is crop residue from corn or corn stover, everything that's left over of the plant after you harvest the grain. This is a free, locally available resource that could make insect farming more feasible. In our previous laboratory studies, we were able to feed edible mealworms a diet of 100% stover, but it did reduce the nutrient content of the insects, especially in terms of protein. And this is not surprising because stover is not particularly nutritious for insects. But our mealworms did survive, and they did retain meaningful amounts of critical nutrients that could impact public health. But we'd like the insects to thrive and do better. So we were wondering if we could modify stover to make it more amenable as an insect feed. I really wanted to make sure my work could translate from a laboratory to an applied setting, so I was really excited when we were able to partner with a brand new cricket farming project through NutriPeople, a small nonprofit out of Italy. And we were able to apply some of our previous knowledge. We had learned a lesson, so we had done the mealworm work kind of in tandem with my ethnography in Zambia, and we realized quickly that mealworms, while edible and tasty and easy to farm, are not the right species for insect farming in Zambia because they're not culturally appropriate or valued as insects as food. But the two-spotted field cricket, shown here, Gryllus bimaculitis, are consumed in numerous regions across Zambia, and NutriPeople had set up some community-based collective cricket rearing farms in a rural part of the southern province. And the farmers had set up a method of farming crickets using mostly a corn-soy mix and scraps from their farms and their vegetable gardens. We quickly learned that the number one production challenges these farmers were having was the cost of feed. They simply were having to divert human food to feed their crickets or buy corn and soy at the market to feed their crickets. So it wasn't really economically sustainable just yet. Also, they struggled with water access and extreme heat, but those issues are for another lecture, another talk. And here are some pictures of the cricket farms in Zambia. You can see that they're using kind of simple brick little houses and plastic bins and egg cartons to keep their cricket populations going. One idea we had for crop residue modification was to see if culinary mushrooms could actually help increase the value of corn stover as a feed for insects. So this is the work of my graduate student, Martin Ventura, who I sometimes call the cricket wrangler, and in my mind also called the mushroom magician. Could spent Pleurotus mushroom substrate function as a good feed for crickets then? Well, crop residues are typically low in protein and rich in lignin, which is why they're not a great feed amendment for insects. But fermentation of residues by Pleurotus oyster mushrooms can reduce the carbon to nitrogen ratio by about 40% and concentrate that nitrogen, and also degrade lignin and increase the available sugars and nutrients to crickets. Pleurotus mushrooms also grow really well on 200 plus crop residues and other waste streams. In the process, you would then generate mushrooms, which are food, and a spent substrate, essentially a waste, which could be used as cricket feed. Plus, mushrooms are already a revered part of Zambian cuisine, so could this be a win-win? We then designed an experiment to answer our primary research question. Is Pleurotus fermented corn stover an appropriate feed adjunct for the production of Gryllus bimaculitis edible crickets? Martin, my graduate student, actually drew the graphic here, which explains the process really simply. First, our collaborators harvested corn grain from their organic fields, leaving behind that lignin-rich crop residue or stover, which we then removed from the field, dried, and chopped into little pieces. We then pasteurized it and inoculated it with Pleurotus ostreatus or oyster mushroom mycelium. The bags that we inoculated in were allowed to ferment for a set number of weeks in controlled conditions. Some were also moved into fruiting conditions such that the mushroom bodies would grow or fruit. And at the end of our set time points, we harvested the mushrooms, yielding an ample supply of that spent substrate left over to feed our crickets. And then in the lab, we reared crickets using our experimental feed formulations as well as a control. And we analyzed their growth performance and micronutrient content. So here are some pictures of our experimental setup. And we reared our crickets for about 5 weeks, giving them either a controlled diet with unfermented stover or one of 6 experimental feeds which contained 40% of that fermented substrate that had undergone variable durations of fermentation. And then we were measuring maturation or development of the insects. We weighed the total cricket biomass of an entire bin or cage because that's an indicator of yield that a farmer would care about. We also measured individual cricket body mass change and also survivorship or mortality. Jumping straight to results, was this a suitable feed for our crickets? Nope, it wasn't. According to the crickets themselves, the fermented feeds led to higher mortality, slower growth performance, and cannibalism later in the study. So crickets that were fed on that unfermented stover, the control feed, actually had the highest harvestable mass at the end. They matured the fastest. They were the largest change in weight over time and the highest survivorship. However, something interesting that we did observe is that if a cricket survived, they gained approximately the same amount of weight regardless of the feed treatment that they were given, including the control. So as you can see here on the left, individual adult mass of crickets at the end of the study did not significantly differ between that 0-week control on the far left and any of the feed treatments on average. So the crickets were about the same size if they survived. And yet you can see on the right in the unfermented control feed, it had a significantly higher total harvestable mass than the other feeds, likely due in part to the high mortality of crickets eating the other feeds. So again, the yield is what the cricket farmers care most about, but this was pretty interesting. In looking at our results, we had more questions than answers. The early mortality that we saw in some groups of crickets suggests something toxic. So something in this feed substrate is actually killing our crickets. Nutrient stress is usually the leading cause of cannibalism in insects. So, you would guess that, maybe these feeds are just devoid of the nutrition that crickets need, which is why they're eating each other later in the experiment. But the nutritional composition of our feeds did not vary very much between the control, the unfermented control, and the long duration fermented feeds. So we don't know what's going on. Essentially, there is more research that we need to understand why the crickets did not thrive on this diet. Despite all of this, I think we should keep the faith in mushroom spent substrate as a potential insect feed ingredient using crop residue. And that's because mushrooms have some amazing properties, and we tested only one mushroom, which we selected because it's really easy to culture and it's ubiquitous around the globe. We have anecdotal evidence from cricket farmers here in the U.S. that other spent mushroom substrates may work as cricket feed amendments, including shiitake mushrooms. So we're not giving up. We continue to search for feasible and useful feed options for our partner cricket farmers in Zambia. But I'm highlighting this kind of sad non-result study just to show you that farming insects is trickier than it may at first appear, depending on context and species. Now I'd like to switch gears and think about the health implications of insect consumption. So a primary question that has been nagging in my mind since I started this work is what if insects were part of the daily diet for large populations, just a small amount every day? How could this impact nutrition and public health? I was able to explore this question along with collaborators at Harvard last year as we considered the nutritional benefits of increasing insect consumption in Africa and Asia, and this was published in Environmental Research Letters. In this study, we explored what impact modest daily insect consumption might have on nutritional status and health in regions with a high prevalence of nutrient deficiencies currently. We modeled the impact of just 2.5, 5, and 10 grams per day of edible insects on the total nutrient intake and population-wide risk of deficiency for specific nutrients of concern, of which insects are characteristically good sources. So we considered protein, zinc, folate, vitamin B12, and iron. I should mention that we applied the widely utilized United Nations Sustainable Development Goal regional groupings to our study such that we could assess the impact of adding insects to the diet for large population groups in both Africa and Asia. And these regional groupings were very useful in helping us frame and put bounds around our study. So we focused our study on the SDG regions specifically shown here, which were good representative contexts where nutritional deficiencies are prevalent today and insect consumption is already relatively common, which suggests a greater likelihood of widespread acceptance of insect eating. We looked at sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa and Western Asia, Central and South Asia, as well as East and Southeast Asia. For each region, we identified 4 to 8 insect species with available, reliable nutrient data that are currently consumed by at least some groups in the region, as well as insect species that are farmed, semi-cultivated, or have a realistic potential to be farmed in the near future. This is because we cannot assume that one insect species would be adopted in all of these places or all of these contexts, so we wanted to have a representative sample. The countries here in gray had insufficient baseline data, nutritional data, so they were excluded from our model. To run our model, we of course first needed to know the nutrient content of the representative species of insects that we had selected. So we thus collected and aggregated nutrient data from numerous published sources, which was quite the task because these data are not easy to find nor interpret. We carefully vetted all of these data and excluded references that were unreliable to generate our own kind of data set that we could feed into our model. So I don't want to get into the weeds on the model, but essentially we compared the nutrient contribution gained from eating different quantities of edible insects against a baseline supply of each of those nutrients in each country. And to estimate the baseline dietary supply of nutrients, we used the Global Expanded Nutrient Supply Dataset, which was developed by Harvard and estimates nutrient supplies across a wide variety of countries in the globe. And then we used Monte Carlo simulations to estimate the range of possible nutrient contributions from insects iteratively by randomly selecting an insect from our insect database and randomly choosing foods from genus. Our results demonstrated that the benefit of adding just 5 grams of insects per day to the diet would be significant in reducing the risk of nutrient deficiencies for all those nutrients that I mentioned across most of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, with a lesser effect on North Africa and Western Asia, but still a positive impact. Factors that influence these differences in our model likely include the baseline level of risk for nutrient deficiencies. So obviously insects can have a bigger impact on deficiency risk when there's already widespread malnutrition. So just small increases in nutritional intake make a big difference there. Also, the size of the population, current dietary trends, and of course the nutrient composition of the farmable species selected for each region played a role. With a complex model like this, it's sometimes really helpful to look at a case example. So if we consider Madagascar, we found with our model that it could be helped significantly by adding insects to the diet. You know, it's a country of about 24 million people where an estimated 80% of calories come from cereals and starchy roots like cassava, so really high in carbohydrate, potentially low in protein. And baseline rates of nutritional deficiency risk are among the highest in the world, so lots of undernutrition. Adding just 5 grams of insects per day to the diet, the dried insects, could lower the risk of protein deficiency by 3.2% or affecting 910,000 people. So it looks like a small percentage, but a significant impact on the population. For zinc deficiency, it could reduce the risk for 1.5 million people, and for folate, 1.9 million people, and for B12, 1.3 million people. So this illustrates the potential for countries to make considerable improvements to their public health and nutritional status using insect farming and insect consumption, even when that consumption is very low on a daily basis. Let's end our discussion of this study by considering the global impact of supplementing diets with edible insects. Our model showed that adding 5 grams per day of edible insects to diets just in the regions that we included in the model could yield 67 million fewer people at risk of protein deficiency, 166 million fewer people at risk of zinc deficiency, and 237 million fewer people at risk of folate deficiency. So these are just examples of the summation of what the model is telling us. But most importantly, I think this confirms my viewpoint that insect agriculture and insect consumption is worth exploring from a global health perspective alone, not to mention potential environmental benefits as well. The last study that I want to mention today was a clinical trial where we were able to look at the impact of cricket consumption on gut microbiota in healthy adults using a double-blind randomized crossover clinical trial. Our primary research question for our clinical trial was, are there benefits to consuming insects beyond their nutritional value when they are fed to a healthy U.S. population? So we used this clinical trial to investigate the effects of consuming 25 grams per day of whole cricket powder for 14 days. Looked at the human health effects. So we used a pretty high dose of cricket to kind of mimic the amount that people get when they put protein powders into their food, smoothies, etc., and so that we could get a high dose of insect fiber. So we were thinking about the benefits of insects beyond nutrition, because in technical terms, we were looking at fiber, which, while essential for health, is not digested by us, so it's not necessarily a traditional nutrient. The justification for this work is clear. While the nutritional value of edible insects is widely documented, the benefits of insect fibers have not been thoroughly investigated. Chitin is the primary fiber in insects. It's a main component of the exoskeleton and other parts of insect bodies. So the question is, could chitin serve as a prebiotic? And you're all certainly familiar with probiotics, which are those live, healthy, good bacteria that you find in things like yogurt. But by prebiotic, I mean non-digestible food items that actually promote the growth of those beneficial good bacteria in the gut, or probiotics. So prebiotics are food for probiotics. So for all of our sanity, I don't want to go into the weeds on the chemistry, but you should know that chitin is considered an insoluble fiber. It's very similar in structure to indigestible cellulose, but through the process of deacetylation, which could happen in digestion, chitin may transform or be changed into its more soluble form, such as chitosan and chitin oligosaccharides, which are known to be prebiotics. So historically, we didn't think that humans could digest chitin at all. We now know that we have enzymes or chitinases in our lungs as well as our guts that could help break down chitin, but it's a question that is still being answered. And why do we care about the gut? Well, our microbiome actually has 3 times more bacterial cells than we have human cells in our whole bodies. And those cells go on to encode 100 times more genes. There's extensive research demonstrating that the microbiota responds to nutritional cues or dietary changes and goes on to generate hormone-like signals that influence everything from our normal physiology and metabolism to our immune system and even our mental health. At the time of my study, no comprehensive clinical trials had previously looked at the tolerability of eating insects nor the impact of insect fibers on microbiota in adults or in humans. To answer our study questions, we partnered with Colorado State University to conduct this randomized clinical crossover study. And first, we recruited 20 healthy volunteers. We excluded anyone with major food allergies, anyone who had recently used antibiotics, was on medications, was pregnant, or was facing major health challenges. The goal was to infuse each participant's diet with at least 25 grams of cricket per day in the form of a prepared breakfast, which consisted of a pumpkin muffin and a chocolate malt smoothie with dry ingredients, which was then mixed with milk. So for this study, we used a commercially available food-grade 100% whole cricket powder made by a Canadian company called Entimo Farms. I had the powder analyzed by a commercial lab, and we found that it contained about 8.5% fiber by weight, and the majority of that fiber was insoluble, or about 7.3% of it was insoluble, so we believe that is mostly chitin. Participants therefore got a little more than 2 grams of insect fiber per day in their diet in our study. So all participants in the study were allocated to one of two cohorts, and each volunteer served as their own control, as a crossover study works. Participants were fed a prepared breakfast for 14 days, either the one that contained 25 grams of powdered cricket or the one that contained no cricket and was a control. There was a 14-day washout period before the participant then received the opposite treatment or the opposite breakfast to eat for 14 days. At baseline and after each treatment period, we collected blood and stool samples, and we also asked the participants to fill out a GI questionnaire to track any side effects. We used those fecal samples to look at microbiota and blood samples to track tolerability and toxicity. So basically, we had a lot of college students in our study, so we gave them crickets and they gave us poop, and it was a fair exchange. Jumping right into the results here, we had 20 healthy adults between the ages of 20 and 48 with normal body mass indexes enrolled in our study, and surprisingly, all 20 completed the study. I should note that in general, the health and age of this population is not representative of the American public. Our participants were younger, healthier, and had a lower average BMI. In terms of tolerability of consuming crickets, we pooled all the responses from the GI questionnaire for each treatment period, and the responses were run through a linear mixed effects model, and ultimately we saw no changes or side effects in GI function reported across the study relative to baseline. So no one was experiencing any dramatic or severe side effects, even when consuming a pretty high dose of a novel food, the cricket powder. We also didn't see any indication of toxicity from eating crickets. The blood chemistry analyses of various indicators included looking at things like sodium, potassium, glucose, calcium, liver enzymes, and other enzymes, and we saw no significant differences throughout the study. This indicates a general tolerability and no toxicity observed from consuming the study dose of 25 grams of cricket for 14 days in our study. The cricket treatment was also associated with a slight increase in alkaline phosphatase, or ALP, with some limited certainty. But alkaline phosphatase is a liver enzyme, and low levels of ALP are sometimes associated with malnutrition. So an increase might be indicative of improved gut homeostasis. But regardless of the effect, I want you to know that most participants retained ALP enzyme values within the normal range. So this indicates normal liver function. So the takeaway is that 25 grams per day of cricket was non-toxic and tolerable to our study participants, but may be shifting something slightly relative to gut function. We looked at changes in 13 circulating plasma cytokines in this study to measure kind of systemic inflammation. Cytokines are those cell signaling proteins that you may have heard of, and when we did this, we saw only one significant change. We found that the cytokine tumor necrosis factor alpha, or TNF-alpha, was significantly lower after cricket consumption compared to the control diet. So TNF-alpha is a very common cytokine, very commonly studied, and it is considered a pro-inflammatory cytokine. So increased levels in the plasma of TNF-alpha have been associated with intestinal inflammation. And on the other side of the coin, reduced levels of TNF-alpha have been associated with improvements in gut barrier function and how the gut protects disease. Additionally, as I mentioned previously, we saw that low ALP, or low alkaline phosphatase, and that's associated with poor nutrient absorption. Thus, our observation of increased ALP with cricket consumption and reduced circulating TNF-alpha together is suggestive of an overall improvement in intestinal homeostasis. So these data are suggesting that eating crickets may improve gut health and reduce systemic inflammation, but small study, we need a lot more research to confirm these findings and understand the mechanism. Now moving on to what we saw in terms of gut microbiota in the participants. As you can see here, there were no significant changes in phyla-level microbiota composition observed across the study. So nothing really dramatic happened after eating the control diet, after eating the treatment diet, or compared to baseline. So this is suggestive of stability in microbiota across treatments, which is actually a good sign because huge shifts here would indicate dysbiosis or major problems in the gut. So we didn't see that. We saw stability indicating that consuming 25 grams per day of cricket is probably just fine. What we did see were some changes in the abundance of certain bacterial taxa. So this graph shows the results of our microbial analysis and demonstrates or highlights the taxa that significantly contributed to differences in the microbiota after the cricket treatment and the control treatment. So only 5 bacterial taxa were significantly increased after cricket consumption, shown here in blue. But I think it's worth pointing out the most interesting news, which is that specifically the probiotic species Bifidobacterium animalis increased with the cricket diet compared to the control. And this was the greatest overall change that we observed in our intervention. There were also 10 species of bacteria that decreased after cricket consumption relative to the control, shown here in red. But I want to focus on the most significant change that we saw in the name of brevity today. And I should note that we don't know much about all of these taxa, but more is being revealed through scientific research every day. So again, our most interesting finding was that 5.7-fold increase that we saw in the probiotic Bifidobacterium animalis after our participants ate the cricket breakfast. Bifidobacterium animalis is one of the best studied probiotics. It's known especially for pathogen inhibition, which is one of the primary mechanisms by which probiotics influence human health. There's a commercial strain of this probiotic. You may find it in things like yogurt, and it has been tested in clinical trials and been shown to improve gastrointestinal function, protect against diarrhea, reduce side effects from antibiotic use, and increase resistance to respiratory infections. So all really positive health outcomes associated with high abundance of this probiotic in one's gut. There are chitin oligosaccharides that have been reported to be bifidogenic or in laboratory studies. So chitin oligosaccharides are the really soluble derivative of chitin that happens through the process of deacetylation or potentially digestion. So basically, the soluble form of chitin in the laboratory has promoted the growth of bifidobacteria. So this is in alignment with our findings, although to our knowledge, this is the first time a whole food containing chitin has demonstrated bifidogenic potential in humans. To my knowledge, this was the first study of its kind that showed that cricket consumption was safe at our study dose and that eating crickets did exhibit some prebiotic effects. I didn't describe this in detail to you today, but we did not see any change in mucosal immunity from eating crickets or the cricket diet. But as I did mention, we saw that increase in alkaline phosphatase and a decrease in tumor necrosis factor alpha, which together are suggestive of improvements in intestinal homeostasis. So the takeaway for me is really that more research is warranted. Insects may be impacting the microbiota of people who consume them. And this was a really small pilot study. We only had 20 participants. But billions of people are likely ingesting insects regularly or occasionally around the globe. So we need more clinical trials to assess potential benefits and risks of insect consumption. If you would like all the details, this study was published in Scientific Reports. And I do just want to give you a quick update, and that is since the publication of this paper, several laboratory in vitro studies have demonstrated prebiotic effects with insects and chitin derivatives in the lab. So they've used the fibers and soluble derivatives of chitin as a feed source for probiotics in petri dishes, essentially, and they have seen that it acts as a prebiotic, promoting the growth of those probiotics. As with any study, particularly a pilot exploratory study, there are limitations. Of course, this was a small sample size and a short duration intervention, and we are not able to do the gold standard and control the full diet of our participants. But it was an appropriate study for this kind of first pass at gaining information about health impacts from consumption. We cannot speak also directly to that question of how chitin is being digested and utilized because we fed people whole insects. So our next steps are actually happening right now. We are kind of repeating a similar experiment using a crossover design with an IBS population. So these are folks that already have some gut health issues and they have higher levels of systemic inflammation. So hopefully if the insect chitin is effective in addressing these issues, we will see it quickly. Our intervention will actually not use whole insects, but instead we have extracted and isolated cricket chitin from the crickets themselves, and we will be giving people a supplement with 4 grams per day in capsules, and then our participants will take these for a longer amount of time, 30 days, and then we'll look at microbiota and systemic inflammation again, and hopefully have a better sense of mechanism. So before we end here, I want to address the elephant in the room, and that is that if you really want edible insects to make a tangible impact on climate change, we actually need populations that eat a lot of meat to eat insects instead or reduce their meat consumption. So the question is, will Americans ever really eat insects? And I think Western aversion is really important to understand. It stems from a history, at least in part, from a history of ethnocentrism and othering, whereby the first Europeans to North America and other parts of the world observed local people eating food that was different from their own, like insects, and immediately perceived it to be inferior or disgusting. Also, we have, at least here in the United States, a strong cultural taboo against eating insects. We think of them as pests that transmit disease, and we stereotype them very negatively in popular culture. If you remember that show, Fear Factor, for example, experiences with insects are negative. We also live lives that are fairly separate from insects and separate from nature. We have screens on most of our windows. We seal our doors. We're fairly ecophobic. If we find an animal or an insect in our house, we want to kill it immediately. So there isn't a lot of harmony, I would say, among the average person in the U.S. with insects that are in their environment. And also, we have to look at the history of evolution and the diet. So our ancestors that migrated to northern latitudes were living in colder places. And in the tropics, insects might be available, different insects might be available year-round, but in these northern latitudes, they had to put energy into finding good food sources that were available in those colder months, including wild game. So insects were just not necessarily the primary focus for food. But despite these drivers of aversion and our rejection of insects as food, I do want to point out that food culture changes, and it changes quickly. 20 to 30 years ago, no one in the U.S. was eating sushi. Raw fish was considered somewhat disgusting and taboo, but slowly it kind of infiltrated from the coasts. It started in San Francisco, New York, and it was fancy and posh, and now you can get sushi at a gas station in Nebraska. So likewise, perceptions of soy and soy milk, by the way, I don't recommend eating sushi from a gas station in Nebraska, but similarly, perceptions of soy milk, and tofu were not initially positive. But with some strategic health messaging, soy products have been readily adopted in the U.S., and you can get a soy latte pretty much anywhere. It just takes time and exposure. Chefs today face a new task of how to play with, amplify, and utilize, with all their unique properties, edible insects as a food ingredient. Some chefs are disguising insects by using them as a powdered supplement to something like a pancake, as shown here. Others are being bold and really forward-facing with insects. Some traditional insect foods are making it big time, like the chapulines, which is a traditional roasted and spiced Mexican grasshopper, which you can now buy at the Seattle Mariners baseball stadium. But this is all to say that the culinary tide is changing. And the tide is changing really quickly. Currently, there are probably more than 30 U.S. and Canadian-based companies that use edible insects in their products. They range from cricket bars to mealworm crackers to cricket pasta, focused on just a handful of insects, but it really is, changing the game. Investment in this space has grown exponentially in recent years. The French company Insect, or Y-Insect, has recently added $224 million in equity to the $150 million that they previously raised to produce mealworms as an efficient and nutrient-dense feed product. In North America, there are companies like EnviroFlight and Interafeed that are leading the industry in using black soldier flies to break down waste and generate a feed product. Barclays, surprisingly, actually put out a major report a couple years ago, estimating that insect agriculture will likely see compound annual growth rate of about 28% in the future, and that the industry is predicted to reach almost $8 billion in value by 2030. Many people ask me if they personally have to eat insects to make a difference, and I think the answer is no. It's okay to not want to eat insects. After all, you probably didn't grow up eating them if you lived in the United States. But as a professor and mentor of mine, Dr. Julie Lesnick, says, "Don't yuck my yum." It's important that we don't diminish the cultures and food traditions of other people, many people around the world. In a paper by Professor Heather Loy and her co-authors, they argue that to embrace the idea of entomophagy is to embrace in our bodies, as well as our minds and souls, the full humanity of other classes, races, and cultures. We can all help normalize entomophagy and support the growing evidence base, first and foremost by changing the way we talk about insects as food and talking about it in a more positive light. You can also be brave and attend events to try cooked insects. You can buy some online, or you can support companies that make animal feed from insects. I always like to end my talks with key take-home messages, and today we have 6. First, insects are a totally legitimate food. They can often be reared with a lower environmental impact than conventional livestock. In general, insects require little land, are low-tech to farm, and therefore can be utilized in resource-limited settings. There are more than 2,100 known edible species documented to date, which we could consider, and insects are useful as both human food and animal feed. In fact, there is great potential to use insects to recycle wastes, including possibly plastics. There's some new research on species that might be able to break down plastics now. Overall, insects provide ample nutrients that are bioavailable and dietary fiber, which could boost health. And insects are not a silver bullet. They're not the savior of mankind. They're not going to solve all of our wicked environmental health challenges. But I also want to point out that it's a really nascent industry. We've been domesticating other crops and animals for thousands of years, and while we have some experience with certain species, in general, we haven't fully explored the potential here, and we're really just scratching the surface of what is possible, so we need more effort in this space. Since you're attending my talk, I'm assuming that you've likely seen articles like this. Finger looking good, insects could be the future of food. Maybe you've seen similar articles. Are insects the future of animal feed? Insects, the future of food. Food of the future. Bugs, the vision of food's future. And on and on and on and on. You get it. But I would argue that actually insects are the food of the past, the present, and the future. With that, I'll say thank you very much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.